There are moments in history where the truth did not hide. It stood in plain sight. It walked through fields. It played in yards. It looked people in the eyes every day. And yet no one spoke. In South Carolina, across vast plantations and quiet estates, a strange pattern kept appearing. Children born into slavery who carried familiar faces, familiar eyes, familiar features. They looked unsettlingly like the very people who claimed to own them, not similar in a distant way, but close, too close to ignore. This was not gossip whispered once. It happened again and again, across generations, across counties, across families with power and names that still exist today. Everyone saw it. Overseers noticed. Neighbors noticed. Even visitors noticed. But the land itself seemed to demand silence, because saying the truth out loud would have cracked something fragile. It would have forced questions no one wanted to answer. Questions about power, about consent, about what really happened behind closed doors when the sun went down and the records stopped being written. These children were living proof of a reality that could not be acknowledged. Their existence carried a quiet danger, not because they did anything wrong, but because their faces told stories that the system could not survive hearing. In this video you will learn how this pattern formed, not through rumor or emotion, but through documented laws, social customs and historical realities that shaped everyday life in South Carolina plantations. You will understand why these children were never officially recognized, why their names faded, why their stories were buried under silence instead of ink. You will see how a society trained itself not to ask obvious questions, how denial became a survival skill, and how silence protected power far more effectively than force ever could. This is not a story about isolated incidents. It is about a structure that repeated itself so often that it became invisible, a system where the truth did not need to be hidden, it only needed to be ignored. And by the end of this video you will understand something deeper, that history is not only shaped by what people say, it is shaped by what they refuse to say, by the moments everyone agrees to look away at the same time. These children stood at the center of that agreement. Their faces carried memory, their presence challenged lies without speaking a word. Watch closely. Listen carefully, because what you are about to hear explains not only the past, but how silence still protects uncomfortable truths today. Before we talk about the silence that followed, we need to understand what people were actually seeing. These were not vague resemblances that could be dismissed with excuses. The similarities were specific. Facial structures matched too closely. Jaw lines, nose shapes, the spacing of the eyes. These details repeated themselves in ways that made coincidence feel dishonest. On plantations across South Carolina, people noticed how certain children carried the same expressions as their owners. When they frowned, the face looked familiar. When they smiled, it echoed a smile already known. Even posture mirrored posture. The way a child stood, the way they tilted their head when listening. Small habits passed down without teaching, as if memory itself lived in the body. Skin tone added another layer that could not be ignored. Some children were lighter than others on the same plantation. Not by accident, their complexion sat somewhere between enslaved communities and white households. Too dark to be accepted as free, too light to blend unnoticed. It placed them in a visible middle space that demanded explanation, yet received none. Hair told its own story. Texture, thickness, growth patterns. Some children had hair that matched the owner's family more than the enslaved population around them. These differences were obvious during daily labor, church gatherings, or moments when everyone stood together. People did not need science to notice. Their eyes did the work. What made this even harder to deny was repetition. This did not happen once or twice. The same features appeared in multiple children over many years, sometimes across different enslaved women on the same estate, sometimes across neighboring plantations connected by family ties. Patterns like that do not come from imagination. They come from cause. Observers at the time understood inheritance. They bred animals carefully and tracked bloodlines precisely. They knew traits passed down, so when human traits appeared this clearly, no one believed it was random. Silence did not come from confusion, it came from recognition. Visitors from outside the region often noticed it immediately. Letters and journals described children who favored their owners without explaining how. The language stayed soft, but the meaning was sharp. Favor was a polite mask for something everyone understood, and no one wanted written plainly. Even children within the owner's household noticed. They grew up seeing reflections of themselves in places they were told not to look. That awareness created discomfort early. Questions learned to stay unasked. Curiosity learned restraint. This is why these resemblances carried such weight. They were visible truth. Truth that did not argue. Truth that simply existed. And when truth stands quietly long enough, denial becomes an active choice. Plantations did not function like ordinary communities. They were sealed worlds with their own rules, rhythms, and hierarchies. Once you crossed the property line, authority shifted completely. The owner's word carried more weight than law, morality, or outside opinion. What happened inside those boundaries rarely traveled beyond them. Distance played a role, but control mattered more. Many plantations were physically isolated, surrounded by miles of land owned by the same family or their allies. Roads were few. Visitors were rare. News moved slowly, and when it did, it passed through filters of power. Only what served the owner's interests was allowed to leave. Within these spaces, power operated quietly but absolutely. Overseers enforced discipline. Enslaved people were watched constantly. Movement was restricted. Communication was monitored. Privacy did not exist for the powerless, while the powerful enjoyed complete freedom behind closed doors. This imbalance created an environment where certain behaviors could continue without interruption. Plantations also controlled time. Work schedules, rest, worship, and even sleep were regulated. When every hour belonged to the system, there was no room to question it. Routine became a form of conditioning. Over time, what should have felt shocking began to feel normal simply because it was repeated daily. Isolation was not only physical, it was psychological. Enslaved people were discouraged from forming strong ties beyond the plantation. Families were separated. Language was monitored. Knowledge was restricted. This fragmentation prevented shared understanding from becoming shared resistance. Silence was easier to maintain when people stood alone. For the owner's household, isolation worked differently. Social visits happened within trusted circles. Neighbors often shared the same practices and the same secrets. Mutual silence protected everyone involved. No one wanted to expose what might reflect back on them. Records added another layer of invisibility. Births were logged vaguely. Names were changed or omitted. Details disappeared into ledgers that treated people as property rather than individuals. When something was not written, it could later be denied. Paper became a shield. Religion was also shaped to serve control. Sermons emphasized obedience. Suffering was framed as duty. Questioning authority was framed as sin. This moral structure helped justify what was happening while discouraging scrutiny. In such a sealed environment, accountability had nowhere to enter. Outsiders saw only what they were allowed to see. Insiders learned that survival depended on silence. Over time, the plantation became a place where reality existed, but acknowledgement did not. And when acknowledgement disappears, behavior no longer needs to hide. Before we talk about the children born into this system, it is necessary to understand the position of enslaved women within it. Under the law, they were not recognized as people with agency. They were classified as property. That single definition erased consent before it could even exist. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse anyone who held power over them. Not the owner, not his relatives, not overseers, not guests. The law did not protect their bodies, their choices, or their voices. If a woman resisted, it was recorded not as self-defense, but as disobedience. Punishment followed swiftly and publicly. This imbalance of power was absolute. One side held ownership, weapons, legal authority, and social backing. The other side held nothing that could be defended in court or acknowledged by law. Even obvious violations could not be named as crimes, because the system refused to recognize them as such. What made this especially dangerous was how normal it became. Abuse did not require secrecy when consequences did not exist. There were no trials to fear, no reputations at risk, no inheritance threatened by exposure. Silence was already built into the structure. Plantation culture reinforced this imbalance daily. Enslaved women were expected to serve at all hours. Proximity was constant. Privacy was impossible. Their labor placed them inside homes, bedrooms, and personal spaces where power was concentrated. Boundaries did not exist when one person's humanity was denied. Resistance, when it happened, came at a terrible cost. Women who spoke out were dismissed as liars. Women who fought back were punished. Women who became pregnant carried proof of something they were never allowed to explain. Their bodies became evidence of a crime that could not be legally named. White society understood this dynamic, even if it refused to confront it. The absence of laws protecting enslaved women was not an oversight, it was intentional. Acknowledging their right to refuse would have undermined the entire system of control. It would have forced accountability where none was desired. The imbalance also shaped how others responded. Overseers looked away. Neighbors stayed quiet. Even those who privately disapproved understood that intervening meant challenging ownership itself. Silence became the safest position. This is how abuse continued without consequence, not because people were unaware, but because the structure made awareness irrelevant. When power is absolute, it does not need permission. And when the law supports that power, refusal becomes impossible by design. These children did not enter the world with innocence alone. They entered carrying weight that had nothing to do with their actions. From the moment they were born, their existence raised questions no one wanted to answer. They were reminders, visible ones, and visibility, in a system built on denial, was a burden. They were born into status without choice. The law followed the condition of the mother, not the father. So no matter what their faces revealed, they were enslaved by default. That contradiction followed them everywhere. They looked like those in power, yet belonged to those with none. That tension shaped every interaction before they could even speak. People watched them differently. A longer look, a pause, a quiet calculation. Their presence disrupted the story everyone told themselves. They did not fit neatly into the categories the system depended on. And when systems depend on order, anything that blurs lines becomes dangerous. As they grew, awareness arrived early. Children notice how adults look at them. They notice when conversations stop, when eyes shift, when names are spoken differently. These moments taught them that something about them was unsayable, that their reflection in the world caused discomfort. They often worked alongside others who did not share their appearance. That difference isolated them further, too familiar to be ignored, too powerless to be acknowledged. Belonging nowhere became a quiet reality. Their bodies carried evidence society refused to name, not written evidence, not spoken evidence, but living proof that crossed rooms and fields every day, proof that could not be burned or buried, only ignored. This made them vulnerable in unique ways. They could not claim kinship, they could not claim protection. And yet they could not escape recognition either. Their resemblance made anonymity impossible. Even silence did not erase them. Some were treated with confusing contradictions, favored one moment, harshly disciplined the next, not because of their behavior, but because their existence stirred unresolved guilt and fear. Inconsistency became a form of control. For others the burden was internal. They sensed truth without language. Identity without explanation creates fractures. When no one names what you are left to carry it alone. That weight shapes the mind long before adulthood. These children did not need testimony. Their faces testified for them, and that is why they were dangerous to the lie. Not because they spoke, but because they existed in a way that made forgetting impossible. Speaking the truth in this world came with a cost few were willing to pay. Truth was not dangerous because it was shocking. It was dangerous because of what it would undo. One honest sentence could collapse reputations that had taken generations to build. Families in power depended on public respectability. Their names carried weight in courts, churches, and politics. Acknowledging what was happening would stain those names permanently. It would expose private behavior that contradicted public morality. Once spoken, it could not be taken back. Wealth was tied directly to silence. Inheritance depended on legitimacy. Property passed through clean lines on paper, not complicated realities in life. If truth entered the conversation, questions followed. About heirs, about ownership, about how many people truly belonged to a family. Silence kept estates intact. Institutions also relied on this quiet agreement. Churches preached virtue while benefiting from donations made possible by exploitation. Courts enforced laws that refused to see certain crimes. Newspapers printed what was acceptable and ignored what was inconvenient. Each institution played its part by looking away. Order depended on everyone knowing their place. Slavery required rigid boundaries. White and black, free and enslaved, master and property. Truth blurred those lines. It exposed intimacy where distance was supposed to exist. That kind of exposure threatened the entire structure. People understood this instinctively. Speaking out was not framed as courage, it was framed as disruption, as betrayal, as unnecessary trouble. Silence became the language of belonging. Those who stayed quiet remained protected. Even those who felt discomfort learned to suppress it. They told themselves it was not their concern, or that it had always been this way, or that naming it would change nothing. These rationalizations allowed the system to continue without challenge. Silence also offered emotional distance. By not naming harm, people avoided responsibility. They could benefit without guilt, participate without reflection, forget without accountability. Silence was not empty, it was functional. This is how systems survive, not through constant force but through shared denial. When everyone agrees not to speak, truth loses its power, and when truth loses its power, injustice becomes routine. The law made this reality permanent. It removed all ambiguity and replaced it with cold certainty. Children born to enslaved women were enslaved themselves. This rule did not bend. It did not question. It did not care who the father was. This legal principle shaped everything that followed. It ensured that even when a child carried the face of a powerful man, the law refused to see it. Blood meant nothing if it threatened order. Status flowed only one way, and it flowed downward. By defining children through the mother's condition, the system protected those at the top. Fathers could remain unnamed, unaccountable, untouched. There was no legal obligation, no responsibility, no recognition. The law turned absence into protection. This rule also transformed abuse into profit. Every child born into slavery increased wealth, labor multiplied, ownership expanded without cost. What should have been a moral crisis became an economic advantage. The law made sure of it. Paperwork reinforced this erasure. Birth records listed mothers. Fathers were left blank or ignored entirely. Names were chosen by owners. Lineage was deliberately severed. Without documentation, denial became easy. Even resemblance did not matter. A child could mirror a white owner perfectly and still be sold, punished or worked without restriction. The law stood behind every action. It gave permission by refusing recognition. This rule discouraged intervention from others as well. If the law did not acknowledge paternity, then challenging it meant challenging the system itself. Few were willing to do that. The legal boundary became a social boundary. For the children, this law locked identity away. They could see connection but could not claim it. They could feel proximity but could not cross it. The law made sure distance remained intact, no matter how obvious the truth became. This legal structure did not emerge by accident. It was designed to preserve control, protect wealth and eliminate responsibility. And once written, it allowed the system to operate smoothly, even when reality contradicted it daily. Looking into the face of someone who claims ownership over you creates a fracture that words cannot easily hold. For these children, that fracture formed early. They saw themselves reflected in people who denied any connection. That reflection did not offer comfort. It created confusion. They noticed similarities long before anyone explained them. The same eyes, the same shape of the mouth, the same way the brow tightened when thinking. These were not learned behaviors. They appeared naturally, without instruction, and when no one acknowledged them, silence became a kind of answer. Identity depends on recognition. Children learn who they are by how others respond to them. But when resemblance was met with avoidance, laughter or sudden distance, it sent a clear message. You are not allowed to ask why. You are not allowed to belong. This created a divided sense of self. Part of them felt familiar in spaces they were forbidden to claim. Another part learned to shrink to survive. Holding both realities at once required constant adjustment. Awareness without permission is a heavy thing to carry. Daily life reinforced this conflict. They might be called closer one moment and pushed away the next, given small privileges and then reminded of their place. These mixed signals did not come from kindness. They came from discomfort. Their existence unsettled the people who held power. Without acknowledgement, resemblance became a private burden. There was no language to process it, no story to place themselves inside. Identity without explanation turns inward. It becomes doubt. It becomes shame. It becomes questions that echo without answers. Some learn to study faces carefully, to read mood shifts, to anticipate rejection before it arrived. Survival required emotional awareness beyond their years. That vigilance shaped them deeply. Others tried to erase resemblance in themselves, lowered eyes, altered posture, suppressed expression, anything to avoid being noticed, because being seen too clearly came with consequences. This internal conflict was not accidental. It was the result of a system that refused to name reality. When truth is denied, it does not disappear, it moves inward, and there it shapes identity quietly, persistently, leaving marks that last far beyond childhood. Plantations in South Carolina were not scattered randomly. They were dense, packed with land, labor and power in close proximity. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few families, and ownership often passed down through generations. These conditions made repetition unavoidable. Patterns that might have seemed rare in isolation became common and persistent across estates, silently shaping lives and histories in ways most people refuse to acknowledge. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more powerful insights from history that the world often tries to forget.